Well, happy Halloween, everyone. Welcome to week 4 in our 7-week fall series. We're working with a book called Happiness, a guide to developing life's most important skill by Matthew Ricard. So let's start with a review of what we mean by happiness in the context of our book, because it's not about pleasure, it's not about smiley faces and good feelings. Our definition of happiness is this. He says, by happiness, I mean here a deep sense of flourishing that arises from an exceptionally healthy mind. This is not mere pleasurable feeling, a fleeting emotion, or a mood, but an optimal state of being. Happiness is also a way of interpreting the world, since, while it may be difficult to change the world, it's always possible to change the way we look at it. Another way of thinking about it is that happiness is establishing a reserve of wisdom and compassion, as well as both inner and outer peace, regardless of what's going on around us. And the author tells us that one of the biggest obstacles to establishing that sense of flourishing and having that exceptionally healthy mind are these things that he calls mental toxins. He says that the search for happiness is not about looking at life through rose-colored glasses or blinding oneself to the pain and imperfections of the world. It is the purging of mental toxins, such as hatred and obsession, that literally poison the mind. One of the biggest obstacles to getting rid of those mental toxins is something that we started talking about last week. The ego. Or Mr. Ego. There he is. Mr. Ego, who can often come across as a villain-like character. Like a cross. This guy looks like a cross between the Penguin on Batman. Anybody remember Penguin on Batman? Or Snidely Whiplash, that other famous cartoon villain. And he's telling us that from now on, this gang is going to be run my way. I am Mr. Ego, which is what Mr. Ego does. It wants to run the entire show. Everything has to be my way. The goal, the end itself, and the process is control, to get its way at all costs, no matter who or what gets in the way. So before we can successfully purge those mental toxins, we have to deal with the ego first, because the ego kind of likes the things that create those mental toxins. Hatred and obsession are perfectly fine for the ego as long as they advance the cause of control and gratification. But we want to be careful not to use the tactics of the ego to deal with it. Occasionally I'll hear from speakers who are making the circuit, making the Unity circuit and other centers. And they'll send me these promotional marketing materials, and sometimes they will actually proclaim in those materials that this speaker or presenter has eliminated or eradicated the ego. When you hear something like that, you know who's doing the talking, right? The ego. And you know what to do when you hear something like that. Run in the opposite direction. Exactly. One of my favorite Buddhist authors was Alan Watts, a Zen teacher. And he used to say that the thought that one can eliminate the ego is the height of egotism itself. It's kind of like this next picture here, these two gurus sitting on the mountain. One of them says to the other, I bet I can extinguish my ego before you extinguish your ego. Pure egotism at work. So we want to be careful not to use the tactics of the ego to deal with it. Now the word ego itself, there's nothing sinister or mysterious about the word itself. It's just a Latin word. It means I, as in me, myself, I, ego, I. And every living creature from an amoeba and a paramecium all the way up to you and I, we have to have a clear boundary between ourselves and the rest of the world. For one very simple reason. It keeps us from constantly bumping into things and each other. It's practical. We can't occupy the same space at the same time. We don't want to go walking into walls and trees and rocks and things like that. The ego is a survival mechanism. It's designed to keep us safe. And in order to stay safe, we need this healthy and accurate sense of me, the thing that is being kept safe. However, once we meet our survival needs, that's when the ego starts to get in the way. That's when we can develop this unhealthy sense of personal identity and this hyper sense of separation, which ends up functioning like this. This is another quote from the book. He says, "Out of fear of the world and of others, out of dread of suffering, out of anxiety about living and dying, we imagine that by hiding inside a bubble, the ego, will be protected. We create the illusion of being separate from the world, hoping thereby to avert suffering." We're separate, but we're also independent. And when we develop that hyper sense of separation, we lose track of the fact that we are all interdependent, that we're all in the same boat, that what I do, say, and think affects other people, and vice versa. So the paradox is that thinking we're being kept safe, thinking that we're protecting ourselves from suffering, we're actually creating more suffering. We don't need that kind of ego-based worldview. And the good news is that it is possible to maintain a healthy sense of self, which recognizes our individuality and our uniqueness that need to be separate, without cultivating that kind of egotism that causes more suffering. It starts, first of all, by simply being aware of that distinction. And then it becomes the work of a lifetime. It's an ongoing process of training the mind to stop this constant identification with our story, to stop thinking that we're somehow the center of the universe. And a good place to start is something very simple. Try thinking about all of the different ways that we use two simple words. I am. Put a blank after it. I am, fill in the blank. Sit down and fill it in sometime. You're going to be amazed by all the words that we use to fill in that blank. And it usually starts with all the roles that we play in the world. Job, profession. I am a lawyer, a baker, a candlestick maker, a parent, a grandparent, child, whatever. And then there are these other descriptive words. I am afraid. I am angry. I am sad. Then take the next step and ask the question, are we really any of those things? Or are we just identifying roles that we play or things that we are feeling or experiencing at the moment? I may feel angry. That's an accurate assessment. But am I anger itself? I may practice law, but I'm not a lawyer in the sense that that is my exclusive focus or identity. Those things ought not to be our focus or identity. Now, we're going to use those words that way. We're going to say those things, and this isn't about playing a game of gotcha with yourself or anyone else. It's just about developing that awareness, because this is one of the ways that the mind becomes conditioned. When I say I am something, I'm embracing it. I am labeling it and identifying it as something that is at my core, and that's not the truth. Then there's another practice, which is really the best way of seeing the ego as that illusion, that's what he called it, that illusion of separation. And there's a reason why we hear so much talk about ego and self being an illusion in Buddhism. Buddhists say that a lot, which is because Buddhists meditate. That's what does it. Buddhists meditate. That is their primary spiritual practice. And when you meditate, when you've done it for more than a few sessions, you start to see that there really is no separate self. Beyond the physical boundary of the physical body, everything that creates our self-identity is a creation of the mind. It's a construct of thoughts. A construct of thoughts that have no separate existence except in everything that's firing within consciousness that creates those thoughts and hangs on to them. We like to think that, oh, well, I am my memories of my childhood and all of my experiences. Well, those are just thoughts. And when you think about it, when you think about thoughts like that, memories and things like that, how accurate are they? They become colored, they become affected by other things, and they become very selective, don't they, huh? We remember some things, we forget others, we embellish some things, we suppress others. All of that is going on inside the mind, and just like everything else in the universe, they have no enduring quality. They're temporary, they're ever-changing, and sitting for 20 or 30 minutes in the silence brings that home like no other practice. You begin to see this constant stream of thoughts, one after another. They may have no linkage, or they may have linkage, but they change and they pass. And once you do it long enough, that process begins to stop. It starts to slow down. There are these little gaps between thoughts. Those gaps become bigger, and eventually you realize that, this is the real place. And none of that is there anymore, which is why they call it an illusion. They'll still be there when you get back out into the world. Maybe we should say they're illusory rather than an illusion, but they are not the real permanent thing. They don't exist that way. So that's why Buddhists meditate. They come to that realization. That's why they talk about it so much. And as I said, those practices aren't going to eradicate the ego, but they'll help us to tame it. They'll help us to keep it on leash, so to speak, keep it in its proper place, helping us to maintain a healthy and safe sense of self, but not running the show, not creating this self-centered spectacle of itself. And yet, even with a healthy sense of self, we're still going to have to deal with those mental toxins. They're still going to be there. Those mental toxins often come to us in the form of emotions, and he spends a lot of time in the book talking about how to deal with different emotional states. We may not eliminate the ego, we're still going to have to deal with emotions, but once we learn how to master the ego and put it in its proper place, we're going to be in a much better position to keep those emotions in check. We'll be able to deal with them skillfully. The Buddhists have a term, they call it skillful means. We'll learn the skillful means of dealing with our emotions. We'll be able to control especially the emotions that we consider negative, or what he calls the afflictive emotions. I like that term, afflictive emotions, because there are some emotional states that indeed afflict us. Simple definition of an emotion we get from the book. He says, emotion is derived from the Latin verb emvere, meaning to move. Wow. The word emotion covers any feeling that moves the mind, be it toward a harmful, a neutral, or a positive thought. That's pretty easy. So then we want to learn how to identify whether an emotion is positive or negative. And again, he gives us an easy way of doing that. We look at the motivation for the emotion and the results. He says, if an emotion strengthens our inner peace and seeks the good of others, it is positive or constructive. If it shatters our serenity, deeply disturbs our mind, and is intended to harm others, it is negative or afflictive. So Buddhists and Stoics, they have something in common. They both get a bad rap when it comes to misperceptions about how they deal with emotions. Buddhists and Stoics do not advocate the elimination and suppression of emotions. Neither did this guy. Mr. Spock the Vulcan gets a bad rap too because people think that he tried to eliminate his emotions. He did not try to eliminate his emotions, as this next picture will prove. Hey, if it's a meme on Facebook, it's got to be true, right? Party Spock is in the house tonight. Everybody have a logical time. And there he is smiling and looking like he's ready for a party. Ready to know how to have a good time logically, all right? So the logical way to deal with emotions is as follows. The goal is not to rid oneself or transcend an emotion, not even hatred, but to regulate experience and action once an emotion is felt. Odds are, even if we get really good at this, we're still going to feel the emotion, so the important thing is, what do we do with it? How do we regulate that experience, and especially how do we regulate our action and the thoughts that might lead up to action once it hits? Rather than eliminate emotion, they say we want to master them or manage them. And he gives us three tools, three primary ways to deal with emotions. The three ways he gives us are things that he calls antidotes, liberation, and utilization. Here's how he defines them. An antidote. That's applying a specific antidote to each negative emotion. Liberation is to unravel or liberate the emotion by looking straight at it and letting it dissolve as it arises. Finally, utilization is using the raw power of emotion as a catalyst for inner change. Now, in some ways, it almost sounds like we're being invited to play with fire, right? To embrace, to utilize. I mean, an antidote, fine, yeah, that might help me get rid of it. But the other ones are asking me to play with these emotions, right? Deal with them, embrace them, use them. We might be thinking that if we get too close to certain emotions, we might get burned. And it's actually the opposite. The only way we get burned is by ignoring them and letting them run rampant, unchecked, unexamined. And again, even then our goal isn't to rid ourselves of them necessarily. These are practices that prevent the afflictive, harmful emotions from arising as often as they do. So let's start today with the first technique, which he calls antidotes, and this is the foundation principle that he gives us. One fundamental point emphasized by Buddhism is that two diametrically opposed mental processes cannot form simultaneously. For example, you cannot in the same instant desire to hurt someone and to do them good. The hand cannot be both open and closed at the same time. Closed hand is a fist. It sends one message. An open hand is a gesture of friendship. Sends another message. The antidote to hatred is altruistic love. Therefore, the more we practice filling our consciousness with empathy and compassion, the less room there is for hatred. That song that John just did, put a little love in your heart, put a lot of love in your heart. Love and compassion are good antidotes. That loving kindness meditation that Karen led you on this morning is a perfect example of a practice you can do when John's not here to sing you a song. You can sit down with that loving kindness meditation and learn how to generate that and to dispel the darkness of hatred. We don't try to suppress it. When the mind is filled with its opposite, there's no room for hatred to grow. It's like this wonderful quote from Martin Luther King, one of his most famous statements. He said, "Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that, and hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that." So that's what we have to fill the consciousness with. And it works the same way when it comes to the emotion of desire. The antidote to desire is inner freedom. By inner freedom, we mean a sense of calm contentment that we cultivate by, for example, being grateful for the things we already have and affirming the truth that there is nothing outside of us which completes us. When we're faced with the emotion of desire, sometimes it's just a good idea to stop and look around wherever we find ourselves and find just one thing for which we are grateful, and then appreciate it deeply and affirm that this is sufficient for this moment. Greed, desire, things like that, they won't like that environment. Anger. That's a tough one. Anger can be neutralized by patience. Patience. Now, where do you think is the best place to practice patience? I mean a real life situation. Huh? How about in the car? I think we can all relate to this guy. I do believe that's Arnold there. I do believe that we can relate to this guy, or at least maybe at times we wish that we had a bazooka or whatever that fun looking thing is that he's pointing out the window there. Don't be like him. Practice patience, and the car gives us ample opportunities to apply patience. All right, so just to wrap up the antidotes this morning, there are some other negative mental states, and they're antidotes. For pride, we practice humility. For envy, we cultivate joy. And to drive out greed, we practice generosity. So you can see how that works. So that's all we have time for today. For next week, we're going to finish with the last two techniques for managing emotions. We'll talk about liberation and utilization, and that's going to lead into the great leap to freedom. See you then.